Located in an area of the Pacific that is situated closest to America, it has nevertheless been assumed that these people originally came from the Asiatic fringe, the cradle of the human race. But despite all the research carried out in this area, no solution to the problem has been forthcoming. While I was in the Marquesas Islands, I kept coming across sculptured stone statues among the prehistoric remains, which reminded me of similar relics of extinct and vanished civilizations in South America. Could there be a connection, I wondered. At the same time, it struck me that the light clouds that drifted overhead were always moving in the same direction, that is to say, from South America, day in, day out, month after month, all the year round. The point is that Polynesia is situated at the heart of the trade wind system, and as well as the easterly wind, a powerful ocean current reaches these islands from the coast of South America. Gradually, the possibility dawned on me that ancient civilizations had arrived here from the coast of South America long before Columbus reached America. The Spaniards who discovered America recorded that the native Indians ventured many miles out to sea on large balsa rafts equipped with sails. These ideas, in time, prompted the work which I subsequently incorporated in my thesis, Polynesia and America. This was met by the objection that a racial migration of this kind was inconceivable, as the only vessels in existence along the coast were primitive-looking rafts made of balsa wood. It was asserted that balsa wood was so brittle that the large timbers in the raft would collapse as soon as it encountered the open sea. As the scientific data I'd accumulated had convinced me that Indians from South America had settled in the islands of the Pacific, and bearing in mind the fact that their only seagoing vessels were balsa rafts, I came to the conclusion that these balsa rafts must possess characteristics of which, so far, we were unaware. The only way to test my theory was to build one of these rafts on the basis of the Spanish descriptions, launch it in the sea off the coast of Peru, and find out if wind and current would in fact waft us ashore on some Pacific island. Our first task was to procure balsa logs and build our raft. We'd assumed that, like the Incas, we should be able to cut our timber down by the coast of Ecuador. But when we got there, we discovered that the balsa wood had been virtually decimated for export purposes, and we should have to make our way inland in order to find logs of a suitable size. We were warned that it would be impossible to travel now that the rainy season had set in and the roads leading to the jungle were flooded. We'd have to wait 6 months for the dry season. Meanwhile, the members of the expedition had already set off for Peru, and it was therefore vital to secure our timber as soon as possible. We hit upon a solution. Chartering a small transport plane, Watzinger and I flew over the jungle and landed at Quito on a spur of the Andes, where we hired a jeep and drove south along the Andes, down through sunburnt valleys where llamas browsed and the mountain Indians lived their primitive life. In this way, we approached the rainforest from the interior and found the balsa trees we were looking for. With the help of the natives, we cut down the 9 largest trees we could find, peeled off the bark in the native way, and dragged them down to the river. We then stepped on board our logs, taking with us a certain amount of bamboo, and in company with our native helpers, floated downriver through the jungle all the way to the Pacific coast. From here we had the logs transported to Callao, the seaport town of Lima, the Peruvian capital.
The
Peruvian authorities were so interested in our expedition that the President of the Republic personally ordered the strictly guarded naval dockyard with all its technical facilities to be made available to us, and that we should have the assistance of its personnel to build our raft. The 9 large balsa logs provided the structural basis for our raft. They would transport us across the ocean. We made deep grooves in each log to house the ropes that had lashed the logs together, and to ensure that these would not slide off once the smooth logs started twisting with the impact of the waves. On top of these 9 logs, which constituted the actual raft, we lashed 9 smaller transverse logs. These were to bind the other logs firmly together and to provide a basis for our deck which consisted of a bamboo platform. Bamboo rods were split lengthwise and plated with a view to making the deck as tough and pliable as possible. Indian log rafts and Eskimo dog sleds both faced the same problem. They had no nails or rivets. For this reason, as they had no rigid joints, they had to be as elastic and pliable as possible. Among primitive races, the golden rule was, don't resist nature, but yield to her commands and accommodate. Finally, our raft was launched. A vessel without a single nail, rivet or screw. Everything was fastened together, Indian fashion, with ropes. A small hut made of bamboo rods was lashed to the middle of the raft. Under the vigilant gaze of a number of pelicans, we attached a slab of balsa with strong thole pins to accommodate the steering oar. The last lashings and knots, more than 300 in all, were eventually completed. From excavated graves in Peru, we know that the Indians were past masters at making almost unbreakable rope from tough fibers. We then stepped the masts. Like our predecessors, we had 2 raked masts stepped side by side, joined together at the top. In order to withstand wind pressure, they were made of a wood so hard that it was incapable of floating. The yard to which our square sail was bent was of bamboo poles lashed together. When the raft was completed, it was towed to a nearby yacht club, where the authorities and the general public had an opportunity to inspect it before our departure. Large crowds turned up, including ambassadors and ministers representing 9 different countries. We were treated to numerous dire forebodings. The country's leading shipping exporter maintained that the raft would sink before we were halfway across. The port authorities insisted on a written declaration before we set off, absolving them from all responsibility, while a naval attaché somewhat rashly bet us all the whiskey the entire crew would ever be able to consume that we'd never make it to the Pacific Islands. People were keen to secure our autographs, no doubt convinced that this was their last chance of doing so. After expressing our gratitude to the Peruvian liaison officer for his assistance, the raft was solemnly christened Kon Tiki with the milk from a coconut in order to conform to past tradition. The expedition secretary, Gerd Wold, was given a bouquet of sunflowers as a reminder that Kon Tiki was the name of the sun god in the ancient Inca legends. According to Peruvian tradition, a nation with a white king was said to have ruled the land before the Incas took over. His head is hewn in prehistoric stone statues high up in the Andes. One of these provided a model for the head on our sail. The last we hear of Kon Tiki in these ancient legends is that he was banished from Peru and disappeared with his people across the Pacific. In the Polynesian islands too, people speak of the great Tiki, who brought their ancestors to the islands. We were now going to follow in his footsteps. On April the 28th, 1947, the Pelicans, for the first time for hundreds of years, were startled at the sight of a balsa raft heading for the open sea. A naval tug towed us out of the bay to ensure that we would not be in the way of coastal traffic. We bade farewell to the tug and rowed across to the raft in a small rubber dinghy, which we were later to use when filming the Kon Tiki out at sea. After waving goodbye to the tug, we were on our own, afloat on our 9 balsa woods. The nearest archipelago lay some 5,000 miles ahead of us. That is to say, the same distance as from Callao to San Francisco, or from San Francisco to Iceland, or from Iceland to Ethiopia. On the very first day, the trade wind blew from the chilly Antarctic. There was no one who could teach us how to maneuver an Inca raft, and we had to learn by trial and error from the very first day at sea. All day long, 2 hands were required at a time to hold the steering oar in position. But as we got to know the raft and its characteristics, we discovered that all we needed to do was to lash the helm and the raft would steer itself. After this, we had no major problems in handling the Kon Tiki, as long as the weather was stable. From now on, it was the duty of the man at the helm to keep an eye on the lashings and to make the necessary adjustment if there was a change of the wind, so that our raft at all times presented her stern to wind and wave. We had a female on board. Her name was Lorita, and she was a South American parrot. The first few days, Lorita, in common with one member of the crew, was seasick, but after 4 days, both of them were excellent sailors. Shipping a little water makes no difference, as it all runs out through the gaps between the logs. The advantage of a raft is simply that water pours out just as quickly as it pours in. We had to make sure that the raft always presented her stern to the wind. If we lay a beam to the wind, our bamboo hut would be awash. As long as the sail filled with a following wind, the raft would ride the waves and float like a cork. Failure to react with the steering oar when the wind backed or veered would result in the square sail jibbing. We'd then have to work the heavy steering oar and wrestle with the sail to bring the raft back on course. Otherwise, the sail would flap violently against the bamboo hut. At night, we were always lashed down to prevent being knocked overboard by the sail. The logs were always slippery, and we had no guardrail, and there'd nearly always be a shark following in our wake. In the end, the Kon Tiki would gracefully submit and continue calmly her way with the wind astern. She never made any attempt to turn back. On the contrary, should she do a right-about turn, she would continue on her course backwards. There was never a day when the wind veered right round and blew from dead ahead. It always came from the continent astern as it swept across the Pacific. This is how we determined our speed and the distance covered over the water. One of the crew perches in the bows and drops a piece of balsa wood overboard. We know the overall length of our raft, and a crewman in the stern times the piece of balsa wood as it floats past. In this way, we can, with a fair degree of accuracy, determine our speed through the water. Hesselberg would take sunshots with his sextant, and in this way we could mark our position on the chart as we drifted across the ocean. From the top of the mast, we could look down on the starboard side of the raft where the hut was open, and where we spent most of our time. This was also the galley, which consisted of a wood crate with a primus stove inside, on which we did our best to make meals the European way. After all, we were not Incas. Besides, we were keen to show how seaworthy our raft was. Occasionally, when the Kon Tiki rolled unduly, the wood crate would catch fire, and on one occasion, when the cook had dozed off, the actual wall of the bamboo hut caught fire. Fortunately, water was always readily available on board, and the fire could be put out very quickly. If we got a bit bored with one another's company, we could always paddle off in the rubber dinghy and observe our comrades at a distance. The first time we did this, we failed to realize that getting back to the Kon Tiki would be a problem, as the raft moved at such a speed that with our small paddles we couldn't catch up. Nor could the men on the Kon Tiki reduce speed, much less come about and back against the wind. Even after the sail had been lowered, the Kon Tiki moved at a fair speed owing to the pressure of wind on the bamboo hut. As it turned out, we just managed to catch up on this occasion, and were completely exhausted by the time we were close enough to catch a rope that was thrown out. From that day, it was strictly forbidden to paddle off in the rubber dinghy without being secured to the Kon Tiki by a long rope. It wouldn't have been much fun being left astern in the middle of the Pacific. The nearest land was endless miles away, and we never sighted a single ship in the entire course of our voyage. Our parrot had by now become a real seabird. If the wind freshened, she would entertain us with gymnastic displays on the stays. She would be highly offended if we tried to shut her in her cage inside the bamboo hut. After a month, the Kon Tiki was way out in the ocean. The Humboldt current carried us north almost as far as the equator, after which we struck out straight across the Pacific. Ocean currents accounted for about 1/3 of our actual speed, and the rest was the gift of the trade wind. An average day out at sea would be spent in an atmosphere of utter peace and freedom. The sea would often be so calm and the wind so stable that we left the steering oar to fend for itself and the raft to move at her own sweet will. On such occasions we felt that we were truly living in utopia. The steering oar would bob lazily up and down in the smooth wake, with no one to guide it, left to its own devices. There were no roast chickens flying around, but other delicacies presented themselves with no effort on our part, such as succulent flying fish. The cook's first task every morning was to take his frying pan and walk around the deck, picking up all the flying fish that had landed on the Kon Tiki during the night. They were absolutely delicious. Once a flying fish had landed on the deck, it was helpless, as these creatures cannot fly, merely glide. A flying fish has to thrust itself up from the surface of the water, and is then able to glide for a few hundred yards before falling back into the sea. One fish actually jumped straight into Roby's sleeping bag one night, not particularly welcome as it had needle-sharp teeth. It was some consolation to discover later on that this particular species had never before been seen by the human eye. Two fish of this kind, Gempilus or snake mackerel, landed on board, which just goes to show that one has to voyage on a prehistoric vessel in order to discover new zoological species in the 20th century. Haugland worked at a scale model of our raft using bits of balsa he found on board. When the weather was really fine, journeying across the Pacific on a raft proved to be the best possible way to relax and enjoy life. About once a fortnight, we'd open our bamboo deck in order to check the ropes and sort out some special equipment that we had promised to test for the US military authorities, in particular, a kind of emergency ration which was being developed in laboratory tests, but which had not yet been tried out in the field. We had supplies of nuts, edible roots, fruit and fish in baskets stowed on deck. This special American consignment was stowed between the logs under our bamboo deck. Opening up the deck revealed the simple yet ingenious design of the raft. On top, there are elastic mats made of bamboo reed, and under this stout bamboo poles lashed together on top of the transverse logs. Ensuring that the special packages stowed down there and awash with seawater remained dry was one of our problems. But Watzinger had covered the cardboard boxes with a thin layer of pliant asphalt, which had been rolled in sand to prevent it becoming sticky and provide extra durability. Cardboard treated in this way proved an excellent solution to our problem. Opening up the deck reveals the raft's 5 center boards. The center board was invented by the prehistoric inhabitants of Peru. These are small boards, 2 feet in width and 6 feet long, which are jammed down, more or less at random, in the cracks between the logs and are kept in place with rope. They act as a sort of keel, as well as a rudder, and assist the raft in moving forward and not sideways. Watzinger rips open an asphalt-covered box in order to check its contents. Part of the tests we were carrying out for the US Armed Forces involved 2 members of the crew abstaining from eating fresh fish, plankton, or any other fresh food we might have on board, and subsisting exclusively on the special diet that was to be tested. They were just as fit and healthy when we reached the journey's end as the other members of the crew, so the diet must have been excellent. Meanwhile, Lorita prefers the contents of the basket on which she likes to perch, coconuts, but she's nonetheless an interested spectator. Watzinger makes copious notes with a view to compiling a detailed report once we reach civilization. Prehistoric man didn't live on army rations, but he had his own resources. The sea, with its inexhaustible supply of food, would always make up for any lack of supplies on the raft. The fish most in demand was the dolphin fish, also called the bottle-nosed dolphin, not to be confused with the dolphin, which is a species of whale and not a fish, but a mammal. This fact was of great importance to my theory. Before we set off, experts maintained that primitive people couldn't possibly make such protracted sea voyages. They would perish for want of fresh food, and no fish could be caught far out in the ocean. Fish, they insisted, were only to be found in the currents that sweep along the coast. This may well be the case if one travels by sea in a boat which would scare any fish with the noise of its propeller. But drifting slowly and noiselessly across the water on 9 balsa logs, you'll see fish in large numbers, often seeking shelter under the raft. The dolphin fish had a delicious taste, and if we wanted fresh fish for dinner, all we had to do was to drop a hook overboard 20 minutes before the meal. The simplest method was to thrust a pole with a hook at the end of it into the water and give it a tug as soon as you felt the fish bite. The dolphin fish has sharp teeth, and the man climbing onto the crate is taking a very necessary precaution, as he has already had the misfortune to have his big toe in the jaw of one of these large fish. As long as the fish is raw, it'll provide not only food, but also drink. One of the experiments we carried out, whenever we landed big fish such as these, was to cut a large hole in the side of the fish. This gradually filled with fluid from the fish's lymph glands, and even though its taste wasn't very good, it could be drunk. It contained such a small percentage of salt that it was a thoroughly effective thirst quencher. When it's a question of life or death, neither white men nor Indians worry much about the taste. There's no doubt whatever that primitive people from Peru were able to survive on board a raft drifting along out to sea in this ocean current. When they sailed their raft along the arid desert coast of Peru, the Indians carried ample supplies of water in large waterproof baskets, in large bottle-gourd containers, and further north in thick, hollow bamboo canes. We carried not more than a ton of water, and this proved more than enough for the entire journey. After a while, we came to an area where there were frequent showers, and this gave us enough fresh water to keep going. Following advice received from the Royal Air Force, we also carried out another experiment. On really warm days when the pores secreted a lot of salt, we mixed seawater with our drinking water. On occasion, we'd mix as much as 40% seawater with 60% fresh water and quench our thirst without any harmful consequences. We also collected parasites from the fish we caught and preserved them in bottles. The sea also contained lots of other smaller organisms that we collected and ate, namely plankton, tiny creatures and plants almost invisible to the naked eye, floating around on and under the surface of the ocean. To collect sufficient quantities, we simply used a fine mesh net which was towed astern. When hauled in, our catch resembled a colourful gruel or porridge which tasted, according to which species we had caught, like shrimps, roe or oysters. Occasionally, this would contain something resembling a jellyfish, forming an unappetizing scum which had to be removed. But in every respect, plankton proved highly nourishing. After all, the largest whales live on a diet of plankton. The masthead lookout has caught sight of some large creature emerging from the depths of the sea. Quite right, it's a large whale. We were often visited by these leviathans. The first time a whole school or pod of these air-breathing creatures circled around our craft, we were rather scared. To start with, they kept a respectable distance, but not for long. Soon whales were popping up in every conceivable direction, and when they caught sight of the raft with us on board, some of them turned about and made straight for the Kon Tiki. We realized that the largest whales were bigger than the raft, and we were scared of a collision when these huge creatures headed straight for us, and we had no more chance of stopping a whale in its tracks than of stopping this film. A snorting colossus of this kind will weigh several tons, and it was scary to be able to look straight down into their smooth, shiny blowholes. But it would always dive just short of the raft, gliding down into the translucent depths below our floating living room. Time and again, we could perch on the edge of the Kon Tiki and look down on the broad, bluish-black back of a whale lying almost motionless in the clear water below. We knew that the whales often attack small boats, either crushing them or capsizing them with a mighty blow of their tail, but no whale ever threatened the Kon Tiki. One might make straight for us at great speed, but would always dive in the nick of time. When the whales tired of frolicking around the raft, they'd disappear as suddenly as they had appeared. After one of these visits, we usually checked the lashings. They often broke, but this was not because of the whales. The ropes holding the steering oar in place were constantly in need of repair. The logs in the stern were smooth and slippery, and anyone slipping into the water would be well aware of the many creatures milling around in the sea. By day, there would always be someone at hand to come to one's rescue, but at night, the man on the helm would be on his own. At regular intervals, we made a complete inspection of all the rope lashings. We carried spare lengths of rope, but only enough for a few logs if all the ropes disintegrated. But the experts had been quite wrong when they maintained that the ropes on a balsa raft would be chafed right through. As it turned out, the logs had no effect on the lashings, and the secret was quite simply that balsa is as soft and pliable as cork. The ropes, being harder than balsa, would dig deeper and deeper into the logs until they were completely protected in deep grooves. The radio operators had no easy task. The transmitter had to be watertight, and besides, there was not enough room on the raft to rig an aerial of any length. Robbie solved this problem by making a balloon. Our parrot was particularly interested in radio. Here she is seen closely watching Robbie's experiment, producing hydrogen for his balloon by mixing a special powder with seawater. Once the balloon is big enough, all Robbie has to do is to attach it to one end of his aerial, send it aloft, and get just the right length of aerial. All went well until the parrot decided to bite through the aerial wire, ensuring that the balloon went even higher. The radio operator had his set in a corner of the bamboo hut. With a transmitting strength of 7 watts, direct contact was made with a radio ham in Norway at the opposite end of the world. This in itself was a sort of world record. Here contact has just been made with a radio ham in Los Angeles, who had picked up our message announcing that we are halfway across the Pacific. This means that after 45 days, we'd already covered a distance more than that between Oslo and the North Pole, which meant that we had exactly 1/2 of our voyage left. We were now 2,500 miles from the nearest land. We were entirely alone in a world of our own. We often paddled off a considerable distance in our rubber dinghy whenever there was just a gentle swell. We never experienced a flat calm, however. We had 2 gales as we approached our halfway mark. One of these raged for 5 days and kept us too busy to do any filming. Our sails split, the steering oar broke, and the centerboard came away. There was also some damage to the deck, but we managed to repair most of it and continue calmly on our way. The elements were driving us relentlessly west at an average rate of 42.5 nautical miles a day, or about 80 kilometers. Our record for one single 24-hour stretch was 130 kilometers. We were constantly forced to make our way into the water below the raft to check the ropes and centerboards. This was an unpleasant task. 2 men had to stand by and pull the diver up by his feet should a shark launch an unexpected attack. And had they failed to be vigilant and quick enough, the diver would have suffered the same fate as this fish dangling on a hook astern. With a snap of its jaws, the shark cut it in 2. We were constantly followed by sharks, waiting patiently to pick up anything thrown overboard. We fished shark for a very good reason. In fact, as well as to try shark meat, which tasted like haddock, provided it was sufficiently unsalted by rinsing in water. The main purpose of our shark fishing was to ensure that we got the shark before the shark got one of us, should anyone fall overboard. Lorita's greatest pleasure was watching our battle with the sharks. Hooking a shark was no problem. This creature has a voracious appetite and will eat just about anything. But this must be said to its credit, that it never attacked unless there was blood or fish offal in the water. But if there was, it would attack anything that moved in blind fury. On one occasion, a shark even sank its teeth into a corner of the raft. Once the shark had been hooked, hauling it on board the raft presented no difficulty. But once it was up on the slippery deck, the real struggle began. The brown shark has a skin so tough that it is proof against any knife thrust. To make sure that the great fish would not amputate a foot, or cut through ropes, or snap anything within reach, we had to tie it down securely. It would often lie on deck, trussed up, snapping viciously for as much as 3/4 of an hour. And as we sometimes had as many as 9 of these creatures lying on deck, it was often hard to distinguish between the dead ones and those alive. Sharks have small cat-like eyes on the side of the head and have poor eyesight. They were always accompanied by their companions, the fish, who would swim unconcernedly just in front of those powerful jaws on the lookout for anything edible in the water around. Once a shark had been pulled out of the sea, his faithful friends would be at a loss, and in time shoals of striped pilotfish had attached themselves to the victorious logs and swam on ahead of the Kon Tiki in their typical fan-shaped formation across the ocean. When our parrot joined us in South America, she could only speak a few words of Spanish, but after 2 months, Danielson insisted that Lorita was speaking Spanish with a Norwegian accent. She came to be regarded as the 7th member of our crew. She provided a touch of southern temperament in a world full of so much cold fish. Lorita stayed with us for 60 days, but one day, when heavy seas pounded the Kon Tiki, she was gone in a flash. As a rule, taking a dip in the sea was strictly taboo, but on hot days when the temptation was too great, if the masthead lookout assured us that there were no unwelcome guests lurking in the vicinity, we could venture out. On such occasions, there was always a life belt on the end of a long line trailing astern for the swimmer to hold onto should the Kon Tiki slip away. This was how we usually enjoyed a refreshing dip in the Pacific, with a firm grip on the raft. As a rule, the Kon Tiki would drift at such a rate that anyone falling overboard would otherwise be a goner. One day, Watzinger found himself left behind, and although he swam like a man possessed, he had no chance of catching up with the raft. He was already some 30 yards astern when Haugland dived into the water with a line and managed to reach him in the nick of time. In order to feel more secure, whenever we swam under the raft to inspect the lashings, we built a so-called diving basket with the rather rough and ready materials we had at hand. An old fruit basket from Peru had its sides extended with the addition of rope and slats. When completed, it had the desired effect on sharks as well as on us. We knew that should we have an unwelcome visitor, we had only to crouch down inside the basket, while the crew on deck hauled us out as quickly as possible. The diving basket is lowered for its first trial. After adjusting his diving goggles, Haugland takes his place in the basket. Once underneath the raft, he has a unique experience. Not only does he see the ropes and balsa logs, but numerous tropical fish of all sorts of shapes and colors. It was as though one had an aquarium under one's living room floor, a floating tank that would accompany us all the way across the Pacific. Diving under the raft now proved a highly popular diversion. In fact, the Kon Tiki acquired a new and entertaining basement in addition to its masthead and its deck. We were never going to be really bored. Unfortunately, the film of the interior of the hut was spoilt by seawater, but we have preserved photographs. Danielson is reading one of the 73 ethnological tracts he brought with him on the expedition.
Lyckan i Havana och har inga pengar kvar, sitter i ett fönster vinkar åt en kram. Vill du bli min hjärtasgång? Har du pengar i ditt fång? Jag är vacker, jag är ung. Sjung och hjärtat sjung.
Haugland has just baited a hook with a whole dolphin fish to lure a shark. When we had a visitor we shall never forget. It was the world's largest fish, the whale shark. As we hauled the dolphin fish on board, the monster came gliding straight for the Kon Tiki. The whale shark is easily identifiable, as its head and back are covered with white spots. According to zoologists, this rare giant whale measures from 15 to 20 meters in length. Here can be seen the striped pilot fish that frisk peacefully in front of the shark's wide jaws. When it came right up to the edge of the raft, we saw that its huge toad-like head is so large that its jaws are 1.5 meters in width. Zoologists report that it has some 3,000 teeth in each jaw. So large was this creature that we feared for the woodwork and the ropes should it attack us with its enormously powerful tail. But no attack was forthcoming. It swam calmly up to the Kon Tiki and then dived under it to reappear on the other side. It was so large that when its head re-emerged on one side of the raft, its tail was still visible on the other side. It continued swimming around and under the raft, and naturally we were not a little concerned as to how this visit would end. We had no firearms, only a few hand harpoons and a fish spear. The tension proved too much for Hesselberg. It looked as if the whale shark intended to follow us all the way across. And as it once again approached the Kon Tiki, he plunged the fish spear into its sinewy head. For a split second all was chaos, after which the great monster reared up and slithered down into the deep. The harpoon line snapped, the harpoon broke, and the shaft floated up a few yards further on in the course of a few seconds. The whale shark never repeated its visit. As the days passed, there was plenty to record in our log. Haugland amused himself using ink from a cuttlefish to write with. Small cuttlefish would arrive on their own on deck practically every night. When cut open, they provided an inkwell ready for use. The ink, too, was of good quality, almost like Indian ink used by artists. On dark nights, giant cuttlefish, squid, measuring some 3 to 4 meters in length, would appear on the surface of the sea with their phosphorescent eyes, but they never invaded the raft. Finally, one day we had visible proof that we were approaching land on the other side of the ocean. The first frigate bird from Polynesia came flying towards us. We realized how important it now was to keep a sharp lookout. We were drifting towards the dangerous coral shoals in the Tuamotu group of islands. They are notorious on account of the seemingly endless coral reefs with which they are surrounded. while the islands themselves are so low that they are only seen when one is hurled ashore through surf pounding on coral reef. After being at sea for 93 days, the lookout climbed the mast one morning and announced that he could see land, a low palm-clad South Sea island. We celebrated our arrival in Polynesia by hoisting all our flags and working the helm for all we were worth. But wind and current were too strong for us to alter course. Despite all our efforts, we continued to drift in the same direction, and the island was soon out of sight, astern. Four days later, we were approaching another South Sea island further west and spent the whole day outside the reef, trying hard to find a way through. We were in fact so close to the shore that natives on the beach caught sight of the Kon Tiki and paddled out in a canoe to welcome us. This meant that we had made contact with our first Polynesians. Our new native friends, each one armed with a paddle, joined us in our struggle against our long-termed former allies, wind and current, who were determined to push us further west. We realized now that the overriding factor was not distance, but direction. We had drifted automatically a fifth of the way round the globe in a westerly direction, but working our way a mere 200 or 300 yards in the opposite direction proved impossible. We were so close to land that Haugland even managed to paddle ashore in the rubby dinghy and was very nearly compelled to remain behind with the natives. Once again, we drifted across the ocean. Our visitors departed and returned in their canoes, and the 6 of us were left behind on our unruly logs. After 101 days, we sighted land for the 3rd time. This time we were confronted with a veritable bastion of palm-fringed islands and reefs stretching ahead as far as the eye could see from north to south. We put the helm hard over in an attempt to approach from the rear, as the surf was breaking directly on the side to which we were drifting. If only we could circle the entire coral reef, we might be able to land on the other side in the lee of the surf. But as we drifted inexorably on, we could see from the masthead that the submarine reef was so extensive that we had no chance of avoiding it. All we could do was to prepare as best we could to be cast up on the reef. All valuable equipment was collected in the bamboo hut, which we covered with canvas for protection. We then hastily removed the bamboo deck and cut all the ropes that bound the dagger boards. Once these were pulled up, the Kon Tiki would have such a shallow draft that we hoped it would ride on top of the breakers. Every preparation was made for the moment when the ocean would rise up in its wrath and crash down on us. But I gave orders that no one was to swim ashore or try to land in the rubber dinghy, as this would mean certain death on the sharp coral reef. We should all have to cling to the raft and hope that the graced balsa logs would act as fenders against the deadly reef. At the very last moment, Rawby made contact with a radio ham in New Zealand, informing him that we were about to be wrecked on a coral reef and that if there was no sign of life from us during the next 36 hours, he should inform the Norwegian ambassador in Washington that we had perished. His last words were, 50 yards left, okay. Here we go, goodbye. He then switched off and crawled out onto the deck to join the rest of us as we clung desperately to our particular ropes. And then it happened, the worst moment of the whole voyage. The crest of the wave reared up like a wall above us, hurling us into the breakers and down onto the reef. 12 curling breakers propelled us in, but every time we were sucked back by the undertow. The 13th breaker was so powerful that it hurled us over the edge of the reef, and when it receded, we were left suspended on top of the coral. With the arrival of low tide, as the ocean slowly ebbed, we found ourselves safe and sound on top of the reef and were now able to salvage our belongings. The Kon Tiki was now an absolute wreck. The ultra-hard wood of which the mast was made had snapped like a matchstick. The hut had been flattened, the stern crossbeam was broken, and the steering block twisted sideways, while the steering oar and the bow planks had splintered. The bamboo deck had crumpled like a paper bag. there was utter chaos on board. But beneath all this mess, the 9 logs that had brought us safely across the ocean were still intact and had resisted pressure from below. And provided we could hang on to this foundation, we should survive. We managed to inflate the rubber dinghy and started dragging the most important items of salvageable cargo across the reef itself. Both the center boards and the logs were covered with edible shells, which we used to pick off and cook soup from when out at sea. Here we're using a board as a sort of sledge in order to salvage the last of our water supplies. A dead shark had to be removed as the reef was full of poisonous eels which were attracted by the shark's blood. This particular eel had razor-sharp poisonous teeth and was our only real enemy among all the colorful fish in the quiet waters above the coral reef. Otherwise, the entire reef was a fairy tale world of curious creatures and strange shapes and colors. When we had rescued the most important equipment, each crew member seized whatever meant most to him. Here comes the steward with his kitchen utensils. His Primus stove was ruined by salt water, but he saved his pots and pans, and there was plenty of dry wood on land, so we could carry on cooking our food. Thus we abandoned the wreck out there on the deserted coral reef and waded in towards a small palm-covered island which lay inside the reef in the quiet lagoon. On reaching it, we discovered it to be completely uninhabited. I don't think any of us will ever forget the wonderful feeling of stepping on warm, dry sand and walking on solid ground after spending 101 days on a heaving raft. It was a delightful little island on which we had landed, covered with coconut palms. Our first impulse was to climb one of these palm trees and pick some of the nuts, which we knew were full of cool, sweet, refreshing milk, a delicious taste after our long journey across the briny sea. Meanwhile, the radio operators had set up their transmitter under the sail, which was still soaked with seawater. It was important to let the outside world know that we had reached land safe and sound. If we failed to get this news across within 36 hours, the radio ham in New Zealand would divulge his secret, and aircraft and naval vessels would set off to scan the seas for us. It was a great moment for the radio operators when their equipment had been dried and linked up, only a matter of hours before our time ran out, and our message was picked up by amateurs in New Zealand and America, thus preventing the dispatch of any relief expedition. On the headland, facing the spot where we landed, we planted a coconut from Peru. We originally had 200 coconuts with us on the raft, and most of these had been eaten on the journey. The ones left over were planted in Polynesia in the native manner. We spent a week on our uninhabited island. One morning, we spotted a white sail on the horizon on the other side of the calm lagoon, and we waved our flags to attract its attention. The small flag shown here is that of the New York Explorers Club. Shortly after, the first natives waded ashore, impeccably clad in European clothes, at any rate as far as their underwear was concerned. As we had little in common in the way of language, we were compelled to use what might be called international speech. But we did understand that there was another inhabited island on the far side of the lagoon. But they were, above all, eager to know what the radio was. Only 2 of them had visited Tahiti and seen this marvel. Fortunately, we were able to tune in to a station broadcasting South Sea Island music from Hawaii. But the natives were most interested in finding out what sort of boat had managed to land us safe and sound through the breakers on the windward side of the reef. When they waded out and saw the Kon Tiki, they exclaimed that this wasn't a boat, it was a pei-pei. Tay Chief, who spoke French, explained that pei-pei was the name of the sort of vessels described in the ancestral legends. Pei-pei, or rongo-rongos of this kind, were well known in the past and were used by their distant ancestors for ocean voyages. The oldest of the natives knew numerous myths and legends that were of great interest in this context. These even included a song about the Maui, a relation of Tiki, which stated in so many words that he had arrived from a country to the east at sunrise. The natives entertained us with roast pig and exotic fruit, and in return we gave them all the equipment we could spare. Meanwhile, the Kon Tiki proceeded unaided to move further and further across the reef at every high tide. And one fine day, it had moved all the way across and into the lagoon. With the help of the natives, we attached ropes to the bow and pulled the raft to the edge of our little island, where we tethered it to some of the coconut palms on the shore. Today this island has been named Whenua Kon Tiki, which means in Polynesian, the Kon Tiki Island. The raft was so pliable owing to all the rope lashings and the tough bamboo plating that we had only to pull some of the ropes and the hut returned to its original upright position. The reason why the balsa logs were still floating well above the water was that we had ignored the advice of the experts who had insisted that we should use dry wood. Instead, we had done just as the Indians had done, felled the trees while they were still full of pith, which acted as a kind of proofing or impregnation, preventing the seawater from penetrating more than a few inches. In company with the natives, we made our way to their island. Here we planted various seedlings that we had brought with us across the ocean, just as their forefathers had done 1,500 years ago. One of these was the bottle gourd, an important plant grown both by the Peruvian Indians and the inhabitants of these islands before the white man ever came here. The prehistoric voyagers must have carried them across the sea, together with the sweet potato or yam, as well as other plants that were common to both areas. When we arrived on Raroia, we discovered a small boy who was on his deathbed, suffering from a dangerous boil on his head. We managed to make radio contact with a ham in Los Angeles who phoned a doctor. The latter directed the operation by radio, and with the help of penicillin, we saved the boy's life. A few weeks later, news of the arrival of the Kon Tiki in French Polynesia had spread from New York to Paris and from Paris to Tahiti, where the governor dispatched a boat to fetch us and tow the raft to Tahiti, Pearl of the Pacific. When we arrived in Tahiti, I was greeted by my old Polynesian friend, Chief Terriero, who during my stay there 10 years earlier had adopted me as his 28th son, under the name of Terai Matiata, meaning blue sky. The successful execution of the Kon Tiki expedition does not of itself provide proof of the validity of my theory of racial migration. What it proved was that the Polynesian islands are within reach of prehistoric vessels from Peru, and that primitive man can undertake limitless voyages across the ocean. The decisive factor is not the distance, but wind and current moving in the same direction day in, day out, all the year round. Trade winds and equatorial currents are caused by the rotation of the Earth and have remained unchanged throughout human history.